PEI's election was historic, but perhaps not in the way many were expecting.
Islanders responded by granting us a record number of seats, by far the most seats ever won by a Green Party in Canada.
The Green surge wasn't enough to form government, but the party is now the official opposition, a first in Canada. And with a progressive conservative victory, PEI is just the latest province in recent months to flip to blue.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I guess all I can say is welcome to a new day in Prince Edward Island.
Islanders wanted change, but its political leaders campaigned differently until the very end.
We need more hugging in politics. So what does all this mean for the Green Party federally? And what should we make of yet another province voting out its Liberal government? It's Thursday, and At Issue is here to answer those questions and more. Andrew Coyne is in Toronto tonight. Althea Raj, also there in Toronto. And CBC's poll analyst, Eric Grenier, is here in Ottawa. All right, let's start with sort of the big picture, Andrew, and that changing political landscape. We talked about it a little bit last week because it was Alberta. Now it's PEI. Where is the advantage for a federal party in that? Is there one, or are there risks and dangers in those changes too?
Well, the clearest winner obviously is the Green Party. Yes, they didn't win the election, as some polls showed they might, but they've made a historic breakthrough to be official opposition, to have 8 seats, to have won 30% of the vote. What that does, I think, it's no guarantee, but what it potentially does for the federal Green Party is make people look at them in a different way. That it doesn't, I think the knock or the reason why people might not give them a look who might otherwise be sympathetic to them is, well, you can't ever get elected, you're just a protest party. And now they can say to people, well, no, actually, we can get people elected. We are more of a serious party, of a real party. They've been knocking on that door now in several of the provinces where they've been starting to elect people where they hadn't previously. They have that one MP in the parliament in the form of their leader, Elizabeth May. So this just gives them that much greater credibility, and maybe people will give them a look who might otherwise not have.
It does. I wonder, though, how much of that win had to do, maybe I'll go to you, Eric, on this, on the fact that their platform was quite progressive, but not too far left, if you know what I mean. Like it addressed a whole bunch of issues. It wasn't just climate change or just the environment. It was progressive on a lot of fronts.
And it was very local in the sense that Peter Bevan Baker, who's the PEI Green leader, was very popular. He was polling way ahead of Dennis King, who ended up winning, and Wayne McLaughlin, who was the outgoing premier, who got defeated. So I think that we have to take into account how popular the leader was in that case, because if you're looking at the last poll that was done in Prince Edward Island that had breakouts for federal and provincial politics, the federal Green Party was at 10% at the same time that the provincial Green Party was at 34%. So people on the island were differentiating between the two parties. And I think that for the PEI Greens, what played in their favor was, yes, that they had a very popular leader, but that he was offering something different, that in that province that had only ever been governed by Liberals and Tories, that he was another option, a third way to go. And I think for a lot of voters, that was an appealing option. But certainly we shouldn't separate the local factors that contributed to that Green surge. But we're seeing the Greens up pretty much across the country, so I don't think that's a coincidence.
Does that put sort of a new or added pressure on Elizabeth May to do more than she has done in past elections, Althea?
Well, to be fair to Elizabeth May and the Green Party federally, I mean, their platform in past elections has not just only been about the environment.
Yep.
And the last campaign, she did try to get some pretty well-known star candidate. I mean, the former weather person from CBC was running as a Green Party candidate in the last election, in 2015. And there was a lot of momentum. There was another CBC morning show host who was running in Victoria. But once again, Elizabeth May failed to get anybody else elected but herself. I think the problem with the Greens is that they tend to poll actually a lot higher pre-election than come election day. And that's because it's really a problem with all other progressive parties like the NDP, where people look at the ballot on election day and they think, well, do I want to hold my nose and vote for a party perhaps I like less to avoid a party I really dislike? And Elizabeth May is, a victim of that.
But the sort of a couple of things have kind of arrived for the Greens. One is climate change is increasing in terms of the urgency, I think, for a lot of voters as the evidence rolls in of its seriousness and of the lack of progress perhaps that is being made. That obviously plays to the Greens' favor. And I think also there just seems to be a growing appetite for politicians who don't come across as ordinary politicians. And the Greens have a certain earnestness or sincerity to them that's unusual. Now, what will be challenging will to see, can they continue that as the official opposition, where you have to be typically, or traditionally, the expectation has been you're on the attack, you're criticizing the government, and do they start looking a little bit more like ordinary politicians in that case, or do they find a way to do that that is different and new and more in keeping with the traditional Green approach?
Can I just add something about I think federally, if it looks like the Liberals are headed towards the minority, more people may feel more comfortable casting a ballot for the Greens, looking at BC, for example, thinking the Greens might be able to hold the balance of power, and that may give them some sort of comfort than feeling like they're spoiling their ballot.
So that I don't get a million texts from my Conservative friends after this panel, it was a progressive Conservative that won in the province, and I noticed that Andrew Scheer quickly claimed that as a victory for him as well, even though it's a progressive Conservative party there. And we've talked a lot about how all these provinces going blue affects the Prime Minister and the Liberal government. But Eric, what does it do for Andrew Scheer? Good things, bad things? How does it shore up support amongst Canadians, or does it?
Well, I mean, it does give his party's brand another win, but the PCs are not necessarily a very right-wing party.
No.
And when you look at the actual results in the election, their vote actually went down from the last election. So it isn't that there was a surge in support for a Conservative party. There was actually just because the Greens had eaten into the Liberal vote so much that the PCs were able to move ahead. And when you look at the way that Dennis King, who is the PC leader, there seems to be approaching things, he's not going to be in the mold of a Doug Ford or a Jason Kenney. He's already talking about trying to collaborate and cooperate with the federal government, and he does need to, because in a minority legislature, he needs the support of Liberals and Greens to get anything done. So he can't be one of the Conservative so-called resistance premiers that are starting to pop up across the country.
He's probably not as powerful, too, in terms of population and the economy and all those things.
But also, if you look at his platform, most of it could be cheerfully implemented by a Liberal, NDP, or Green party. I mean, I think there's a couple of tax cuts, but the rest of it is very progressive, liberal, left, whatever term you want to use. And as Eric mentioned, he's not going to be taking a tough stand against the carbon tax. He's talked about a made-in-PEI solution, whatever that happens to mean, but it doesn't sound like he's spoiling for a fight.
But it does give them a boost of some kind, does it not? The blue team, it does give them hope in a different way, Althea?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's not just that you have premiers like Jason Kenney and Doug Ford who have actually talked about openly campaigning against Justin Trudeau's Liberals, but you also now have a number of Conservative wins very recently close to a federal election. So those ground game teams are already in place. You can quickly reassemble those former provincial campaigns, and that really does help across the country, whether that's Alberta or in places like Atlantic Canada, where the Liberals are quite vulnerable.
But the broader message of the whole thing, it seems to me, not just this election, but a bunch of recent elections, is change. I'm not saying this versus any particular incumbent, but people are willing to take a look at parties they wouldn't have previously been willing to look at. They're willing to throw out governments after one term, when previously that would have been less likely. They're willing to vote for third and fourth parties, where previously two-party politics was very much the norm. So a lot of the sort of traditional moorings have kind of come loose, and people are much more sort of free agents when it comes to their vote.
And that, Eric, makes your job harder, but it's also, it makes things harder to understand and predict and know where things are going.
Yeah, absolutely. So we need to be ready for that kind of thing. And when people are looking for different options, we're seeing that there are more options now on the table. And if you're a voter who is sick of politics the way that it's done, but you're angry about it, then there's these populist parties that are starting to pop up. And if you're instead tired of it and you just want people to get along, then you do have a party like the Green Party. And I think that's where they have an opportunity.
Speaking of getting along, I do want to talk about the tone of that election, because I realized there was a death of an MP towards the end, and everyone suspended their campaigning, and that sort of changed things. But it was throughout the campaign. The debate was different. The response on election night was different. We saw the PC leader and the Green leader hugging the next day. I mean, sure, it's Islanders, and they are very lovely people, and they're very friendly. But I wonder what we can take from that. Is it just that they are doing politics differently? Surely there's an appetite in the rest of the country to see people behave that way as politicians, I would think. Andrew? There
may be an appetite for it. People always tell the pollsters that.
Yeah.
But when the parties are figuring out their strategies, more often than not, it looks like, quote unquote, defining your opponent, i.e. smearing them as X or Y or Z, seems to be a potent tactic. I think there were special factors. It is a very small electorate, and people know each other. It's less likely to pay off in that respect.
Yeah.
But also, a lot of the platform, as I say, were pretty similar, and I'm not sure that's necessarily a great thing. I'd rather see a little bit more diversity of offerings so the electorate has a more clear choice of policy alternatives.
Althea?
Yeah, I think that, there are 140,000 people in Prince Edward Island, and a lot of people know each other, and including, the fact that the Green leader was the dentist of the PC leader's family. I mean, that's unusual, right? You're like fighting in the family. So, but I do think that the public really wants to see less partisanship. And frankly, it's the media that kind of paints everything as a conflict, and the parties themselves who galvanize in that frame that don't want to see the system really change much. And we bear a lot of that responsibility. I don't think it's the public's fault.
Well, and it is a bit short-sighted on the part of politicians, because at least in Prince Edward Island, there was the indication that a minority government was likely. So the fact that these parties have gotten along and haven't gone too hard after each other means that they will be able to work together. If you're talking about a situation like the federal election, which could result in a minority government, if all of these leaders are going after each other and saying that each one is the worst thing that you could possibly vote for, eventually they're going to have to work together if there is, in fact, a minority government after the fall election.
But I also wonder if it's not a lesson for the country. Andrew, is that me being naive again? But
No, it would be great. I think we do have to think about the incentives within our political system. When so much of it is about turnout, for example, then a lot of it is a payoff to depressing the other guy's turnout and ginning up your turnout by getting everybody really mad about the terrible things those other guys are promising to do. So if we really want to have a more cooperative, collaborative politics, I do think we have to start looking at the incentives built into our system that reward more vituperative, more attack-type politics, and maybe try and change those incentives.
Okay, I gotta go. Thanks, everybody. Appreciate it. Before we go, though, be sure to subscribe to At Issue, the podcast, for extra content. This week, we're talking about why political leaders like Jagmeet Singh this week are sharing their stories ahead of election campaigns. Look for it on iTunes, any major podcast app, our website, cbcnews.ca/thenational.